For 12 years, my boss told me I wasn't leadership material. Then, at the company holiday party, HR casually asked why I'd retired before 50. The room was warm, the music was loud, and one answer drained all the color from his face. The first time my boss told me I lacked leadership potential, I was 27 years old and still believed hard work spoke for itself. His office overlooked the city from the 32nd floor. Glass walls, polished steel. The faint scent of expensive coffee drifting from somewhere behind his desk. Outside, rain traced silver lines down the windows, blurring the skyline into watercolor shadows. I had just finished leading a project that delivered 6 months ahead of schedule. Not officially leading, of course. Officially, I was just another operations manager. Unofficially, I'd coordinated 5 departments, solved 3 emergencies, and spent more nights sleeping on office couches than I cared to admit. My annual review lasted exactly 14 minutes. "You execute well," my boss Richard said, tapping a pen against the table. I waited. The compliment felt incomplete. Then he leaned back in his chair. "But leadership is something different." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "You don't really have that executive presence." I blinked. "Can you explain what that means?" Richard smiled politely, the kind of smile that answered nothing. "It's difficult to define. Some people simply have it." Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, the conversation ended. I walked back to my desk, carrying those words like a stone in my pocket. Not heavy enough to stop me, just heavy enough that I could always feel it there. For weeks afterward, I replayed the conversation in my head. Executive presence, leadership potential. Have it. Don't have it. The phrases floated through the corporate hallways like invisible currency. Everyone understood except the people being judged by them. And yet something strange happened. Instead of discouraging me, it sharpened me, like a blade against a whetstone. I started paying attention, really paying attention. Who got promoted? Who didn't? Who made decisions? Who received credit? Who quietly carried entire departments without recognition? The patterns were impossible to ignore once I saw them. And every time a promotion opened up, my name somehow disappeared from consideration. Not because my performance was poor. My numbers were usually the highest in the division. The explanations were always softer, more polished, more corporate. Not quite ready, needs broader exposure. Excellent contributor. One phrase appeared so often it became almost comical. Future potential. The future seemed determined to stay exactly where it was. A year later, another promotion went to someone I had trained. I remember sitting in the conference room while congratulations echoed around the table. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Coffee cups clinked softly. Everyone smiled. I smiled too. Then I noticed something odd. The new director looked terrified. Not excited, not proud. Terrified. As though he'd been handed something he wasn't prepared to carry. That realization lingered long after the meeting ended. Because for the first time, I wondered if promotions weren't always rewards. Sometimes they were simply assignments. And assignments often went to people who fit a picture, not necessarily people who could do the job. The thought should have made me angry. Instead, it made me curious, a dangerous emotion in a place built on routine. 3 months later, curiosity changed everything. The company sent me to a technology conference in Seattle. Nothing glamorous. 3 days of presentations, networking sessions, and overpriced hotel coffee. The ballroom buzzed with conversations. Screens glowed, name badges flashed under soft golden lights. Most attendees talked about quarterly forecasts and industry trends. Then, during a break between sessions, I sat beside a woman named Elena. She wasn't wearing a corporate badge, no company logo, no executive title, just her name. We talked for 10 minutes, then 20, then nearly an hour. And somewhere during that conversation, she asked a question nobody inside my company had ever asked. "If you're so good at fixing operational problems, why are you working for someone else?" I laughed. The answer seemed obvious. Mortgages, stability, health insurance, reality. But the words never came out, because suddenly, they didn't sound as convincing as they once had. Elena watched me carefully, not judgmentally, almost knowingly, as if she'd seen this moment happen before. There are thousands of companies with the exact problems you solve every day, she said. Most of them don't even know those problems can be solved. The noise of the conference faded around me. Conversations blurred into distant echoes. For a second, it felt like someone had opened a hidden door in a room I'd occupied for years. And through that doorway, I caught a glimpse of something unfamiliar. Possibility. Then, Elena handed me a business card. Nothing fancy. Simple white stock. Black lettering. No slogan. No marketing language. Just a name and a company. I slipped it into my pocket. The same pocket where I'd carried Richard's words for years. One card. One conversation. One strange question. At the time, I had no idea which of those things would matter most. But later that night, alone in my hotel room while rain tapped against the window, my phone buzzed. A message from Richard. 3 sentences. Short, professional, routine. Yet one line made me stare at the screen longer than I expected. We'll discuss your long-term future when you get back. For reasons I couldn't explain, the message felt less like an opportunity and more like a warning. When I returned from Seattle, the city seemed unchanged. The same traffic crawling beneath gray skies, the same commuters staring into glowing phone screens, the same office tower rising above downtown like a monument to predictability. Yet something felt different. Not outside, inside. As though that conversation with Elena had quietly shifted a piece of furniture in my mind, and now nothing fit exactly where it used to. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Sunlight spilled across the marble lobby as employees streamed through security gates carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. The familiar sounds welcomed me back. Elevator chimes, muted conversations, the distant hum of printers. Ordinarily, those noises felt comforting. This time, they sounded mechanical, like a machine I had suddenly learned to hear. By 10 o'clock, Richard's assistant appeared beside my desk. He'd like to see you. A simple sentence. Yet several coworkers glanced up. People always noticed when someone was summoned to the executive floor, especially by Richard. I followed her upstairs. The executive corridor looked exactly as it always had. Quiet, carpeted, almost unnaturally still, the kind of silence money buys. Richard was standing by the window when I entered, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city. For a moment, he didn't turn around. Then he smiled. Professional, measured, practiced. How was Seattle? Productive. I'm glad. He sat, motioned toward the chair across from him. The same chair where years earlier he had informed me I lacked leadership potential. Funny how furniture remembers things. Richard folded his hands. We need to discuss your future. There it was, the phrase from his message. For a few seconds, he talked about company growth, strategic initiatives, organizational changes, the usual corporate weather report. Then he arrived at the point. We've identified a role we'd like you to take. I listened. It would be critical to the organization. Interesting choice of words. Critical, not senior. Not executive. Critical. He slid a document across the desk. I glanced down. The position came with more responsibility. A larger team. Longer hours. Significantly longer hours. The compensation increase was almost laughably small. I looked up. Richard was watching me carefully, waiting, measuring, almost studying my reaction. Then he delivered the line I should have expected. Leadership opportunities require patience. There was that word again. Leadership. Always visible on the horizon. Never quite reachable. Like a lighthouse designed to keep sailors moving rather than guide them home. Something inside me finally clicked. Not dramatically, not angrily. Quietly. Like a lock opening. I realized I wasn't being developed. I was being utilized. the distinction changed everything. Richard continued talking. I barely heard him, because another thought had arrived. One I couldn't push away. If the company truly believed I wasn't leadership material, why did every important problem somehow end up on my desk? The question lingered between us, unspoken. And for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel defensive. I felt curious, dangerously curious. That evening, instead of driving home, I parked near the waterfront. The harbor glowed beneath fading sunlight. Boats rocked gently against their moorings. The air smelled of salt, diesel fuel, and distant rain. I sat in my car and stared at Elena's business card. The edges were already slightly worn. Funny. 1 hour of conversation had survived in my thoughts longer than a decade of performance reviews. Eventually, I called her. She answered on the second ring, as though she'd expected it. I was wondering how long it'd take, I laughed. So was I. The next 90 minutes changed the trajectory of my life. Not because she offered me a job. She didn't. Not because she pitched a partnership. She didn't do that either. Instead, she asked questions. Simple questions. Simple. Uncomfortable questions. Questions nobody inside my company had any incentive to ask. What problems do businesses repeatedly pay to solve? What do clients already trust you to do? What would happen if you stopped asking permission? By the time the call ended, darkness had settled over the harbor. The city lights reflected across black water like scattered gold coins. And for the first time, an idea had taken shape. Small, fragile, dangerous. The kind of idea that feels ridiculous when spoken aloud. Over the next 6 months, I built quietly. Nights, weekends, early mornings before work. I wasn't creating a revolutionary technology. I wasn't inventing anything. I was packaging expertise, systematizing solutions, turning years of invisible corporate labor into something companies could actually buy. The first client arrived unexpectedly, then another, then a third. Each one felt impossible. Each one paid more than I expected. Each one taught me something important. The market valued my skills very differently than my employer did. That realization was exhilarating and terrifying. Because once you see your market value clearly, it's difficult to return to old illusions. Around that time, something odd started happening at work. Richard became unusually attentive. He wanted more updates, more meetings, more visibility. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then I noticed details, questions that seemed oddly specific, comments that felt exploratory. His interest wasn't growing. His concern was, almost as though he sensed something changing without knowing exactly what it was. One afternoon, I caught him watching me through a conference room window. The moment our eyes met, he looked away. It lasted less than a second, yet the image stayed with me. Because it wasn't confidence I saw. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty looked strange on him. A week later, my phone rang just after midnight. The caller ID displayed a client name. I answered immediately. What I heard on that call made my pulse spike. Not because something had gone wrong, because something had gone astonishingly right. Something so significant that if it worked, everything could change. Not next year, not eventually. Soon. Much sooner than I had planned. And suddenly time felt very different, as though a clock I hadn't known existed had started counting down. If you've ever been told to wait your turn, stay patient, or prove yourself just a little longer, then you probably know that feeling. The moment when doubt starts turning into determination. Thank you for being here and walking this road with me. There's still more to uncover, and some of the most important turns are closer than they appear. Stay with me. The call ended at 12:43 a.m. For several seconds, I remained frozen in my kitchen, phone still pressed against my ear. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Rain tapped against the windows. The digital clock above the stove glowed blue in the darkness. 12:43, 12:43, 12:43. The numbers seemed strangely important, maybe because they marked the exact moment my carefully constructed timeline stopped mattering. I had planned for years, years, conservative projections, backup plans, contingency plans for the backup plans. The business was supposed to grow slowly, predictably, safely. Instead, one of my clients had just delivered news that could accelerate everything. A major industry player wanted a meeting. Not next quarter, not next month, that week. I stood there, staring into the dark kitchen, while adrenaline moved through me like electricity. Excitement was part of it. Fear was another. But underneath both emotions lurked something else, a realization. The opportunity I'd been building toward might arrive before I felt ready. And readiness, I was beginning to learn, was often a luxury people imagined existed. The next morning, I arrived at work exhausted. The office lights felt brighter than usual, the conversations louder, the air colder. Or maybe that was just me. When you're carrying a secret, the world changes texture. Every interaction feels layered. Every casual conversation carries hidden meaning. Nobody knew what was happening. Not my coworkers, not my managers, certainly not Richard. Yet throughout the day, I found myself studying everyone differently. The analyst rushing between meetings, the director rehearsing talking points before a presentation, the exhausted project manager eating lunch at her desk. I knew these people. Good people. Hard-working people. People giving enormous portions of their lives to a machine that never stopped asking for more. For the first time, I wondered what they would do if they knew there were alternatives. Then another thought arrived, a less comfortable one. Maybe some already knew. Maybe they stayed because certainty has its own gravity. That idea followed me into a leadership meeting later that afternoon. Richard was at the head of the conference table, confident as always, polished, controlled. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. Outside the glass walls, sunlight reflected from neighboring buildings. Inside, quarterly planning consumed everyone's attention. Revenue forecasts, hiring plans, growth targets, the usual corporate rituals. Then Richard said something that made my stomach tighten. It takes years to build influence. Most people nodded. I noticed several executives writing notes. Richard continued, people who chase shortcuts often underestimate what real leadership requires. The comment wasn't directed at anyone, at least not openly. Yet for some reason his eyes found mine. Only briefly. A second at most. Then he looked away. The conversation moved on. Nobody reacted, nobody noticed. But I did. And so did something deep inside me, because the timing felt odd, uncomfortably odd. Like hearing someone answer a question you never asked aloud. That evening, I met Elena for dinner. The restaurant sat beside the water, tucked between old brick warehouses converted into upscale offices. Warm light spilled through tall windows. Soft jazz drifted through the room. The smell of garlic, cedar, and roasted vegetables filled the air. The place felt calm, grounded, exactly what I needed. Elena listened as I described the midnight phone call, the potential opportunity, the risks, the possibilities. When I finished, she smiled. Not the excited smile I expected. Something more thoughtful, almost cautious. What's wrong? I asked. She leaned back. Nothing's wrong. That answer usually means something is wrong. She laughed. You know what's interesting? What? You still talk about permission. I frowned. I don't. You do. I started to argue, then stopped. Because she was right. Every sentence I used contained some version of the same concern. Would the timing be right? Would people understand? Would the market approve? Would it make sense? Would it be acceptable? Permission, disguised as strategy. Elena stirred her tea. The hardest part isn't building something valuable. Then what is? The moment you realize nobody is coming to certify you. The words landed harder than I expected. Around us, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Servers moved between tables. Outside, boats rocked gently beneath the harbor lights. Yet for a moment, everything felt strangely still. Nobody is coming to certify you. I thought about Richard, about 12 years of reviews, promotions, assessments, leadership evaluations, potential rankings. All those systems designed to determine who was ready. And suddenly a question appeared. What if the people doing the evaluating weren't qualified to judge the thing I was becoming? The thought felt almost rebellious, which was probably why it scared me. A few days later, the meeting with the industry giant finally arrived. Their headquarters occupied an entire glass tower downtown. The lobby alone looked larger than some companies I'd worked with. Polished stone floors reflected sunlight like water. Massive digital displays glowed along the walls. Everything projected scale, power, resources, the kind of environment designed to make visitors feel small. Oddly, I didn't. I should have, but I didn't. As I rode the elevator upward, another realization surfaced. For years, I had believed confidence came from authority, titles, position, status. Now I was beginning to suspect confidence came from competence, and those are very different things. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Questions, demonstrations, scenarios, strategy discussions. By the end, several executives were taking notes faster than they had at the beginning. One of them asked if I'd be available for a follow-up conversation. Another asked how quickly my operation could scale. A third exchanged a glance with a colleague that looked significant. Very significant. When I finally walked out of the building, evening sunlight washed the city in gold. Cars moved below like streams of light. The air felt warmer, lighter. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls, 2 emails, 1 voicemail. All from work. All marked urgent. I stopped walking. Something felt off. Not catastrophic, not yet, just wrong. The kind of feeling animals probably experience before a storm arrives. Slowly, I opened the voicemail. The message was from Richard. His voice sounded different, tighter, less controlled. And before the recording ended, he said a sentence that made me stand motionless on the sidewalk while people flowed around me. A sentence that raised far more questions than it answered. A sentence that made it clear he had finally discovered something. Something he was never supposed to know. I listened to the voicemail 3 times before moving. The crowd flowed around me in steady currents, business people heading home, tourists pausing for photographs, delivery bikes weaving through the evening traffic. The city carried on as if nothing had happened. For me, everything had shifted. Richard's voice echoed in my head. Not the words alone, the tone. That was what unsettled me. For 12 years, I had known Richard as a man who treated emotions like accounting entries. Carefully controlled, neatly categorized, rarely visible. The voice on the voicemail sounded different. There was urgency there, maybe even anxiety. And Richard did not get anxious, at least not publicly. I stood beneath the glass tower for another minute before finally pressing callback. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. The knot in my stomach tightened. Not because I thought something terrible had happened, because uncertainty creates its own kind of gravity. The mind immediately begins inventing possibilities, most of them wrong, most of them, all of them distracting. By the time I reached my car, an email had arrived. Subject line: need to speak first thing tomorrow. Nothing else. No explanation. No details. Just that. The words felt oddly familiar, like the message he'd sent after my trip to Seattle. Back then, I had sensed a warning. Now I sensed something else. Pressure. The next morning, the office felt different the moment I walked in. You know how some buildings seem capable of carrying moods? How tension can linger in hallways, the way perfume lingers in elevators. This was one of those mornings. Conversation stopped slightly too fast. People glanced away slightly too quickly. Even the receptionist seemed distracted. I rode the elevator up in silence. Floor numbers illuminated one by one: 26, 27, 28. My reflection stared back from the polished steel doors. Calm on the surface, less calm underneath. When the doors opened, Richard's assistant was already waiting. "He'll see you now." No small talk, no smile. Interesting. I followed her down the corridor. The executive floor always felt a little detached from reality. Quiet enough to hear your own footsteps, soft lighting, perfect temperature, no visible clutter, as though real work happened somewhere else, and only decisions lived here. Richard's office door stood open. He wasn't behind his desk. He was pacing. Actually pacing. I had never seen that before. The sight alone told me something significant was happening. When he noticed me, he stopped immediately. The professional mask snapped back into place. Almost. A tiny crack remained. "Close the door." I did. The click echoed softly through the room. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Richard walked to the window, looked out over the city, and asked a question so unexpected it nearly made me laugh. "How long have you been consulting?" There it was. The secret. Or at least part of it. I kept my expression neutral. "A while." His jaw tightened. Not dramatically, just enough. "Define a while." The sunlight reflected from nearby buildings, filling the office with shifting bands of gold and silver. The room suddenly felt much warmer. I gave him an answer. Not every detail. Just enough. Richard listened without interruption. Then came another question. And another. The conversation felt less like a disciplinary meeting and more like an investigation. Who were the clients? How large were the engagements? How much time was involved? How many companies? His curiosity seemed oddly specific, far more specific than simple concern about company policy. That realization triggered a quiet alarm somewhere in my mind. Something wasn't adding up. Then, Richard sat down, for the first time since I'd entered the room, and what he said next explained everything, or at least part of it. One of my clients had recently been acquired. The acquiring company happened to be connected to one of our board members. A casual conversation. A shared contact. A familiar name. A few dots connected. That was all it took. The discovery hadn't started inside the company. It had arrived from outside, like weather crossing a border. Richard folded his hands. "I wish you'd told me." Interesting. Not, "You violated policy." Not, "This is unacceptable." Not even, "Why didn't you disclose it?" I wish you'd told me. The wording mattered, because beneath it was another message. One he wasn't saying aloud. I wish I'd known sooner. The realization settled heavily between us. For years, Richard had viewed me through a particular lens. Reliable, capable, useful. Not leadership material. Now that lens was cracking, and he didn't seem entirely comfortable with what he was seeing through the fractures. The conversation stretched nearly an hour. By the end, neither of us had raised our voices. Neither of us needed to. Some conversations become important precisely because they remain calm. As I stood to leave, Richard asked one final question. A simple question. Yet, it carried more weight than everything else he'd said. "Are you planning to stay?" Stay. Not in the meeting. Not for the quarter. Not through the current project. Stay. The word hung in the air. 12 years, condensed into a single syllable. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time, I wasn't seeing a gatekeeper, or an evaluator, or the man who had spent years explaining why I wasn't ready. I was seeing someone confronted by a possibility he had never seriously considered, that I might not need his approval anymore. The realization seemed to unsettle him. And strangely, it unsettled me too, because leaving had always been theoretical, a future event, an eventual decision. Now it felt real, close enough to touch. I gave him an honest answer. The right opportunity changes things. Richard nodded slowly. No argument, no speech, no attempt to persuade me, which was somehow more revealing than any reaction could have been. When I walked out, the office seemed unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives before a major announcement, or after one. Back at my desk, I opened my laptop. A new email waited in my inbox, not from work, from the executive team I'd met earlier that week. The subject line contained only 6 words. We'd like to discuss acquisition terms. For a moment, the entire office disappeared. The sounds, the conversations, the fluorescent lights, everything faded into the background. Because those 6 words represented something far larger than a contract, far larger than a client, far larger than a promotion. They represented a doorway. And for the first time, I could clearly see what stood on the other side. The question was whether I was ready to walk through it. I read the email 5 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. Every word, every implication, every possibility hiding between the lines. Outside my office window, clouds drifted across a pale afternoon sky. Phones rang. Conversations rose and fell. Someone laughed near the break room. Normal life continued. Yet the world suddenly felt divided into 2 timelines. The one I had lived, and the one waiting quietly on the other side of a decision. We'd like to discuss acquisition terms. For years, success had existed as a distant concept, a mountain somewhere beyond the horizon. You climb, you work, you sacrifice, and maybe one day you get there. What nobody tells you is how strange it feels when the mountain suddenly appears directly in front of you. The following weeks moved with impossible speed. Conference calls, lawyers, financial reviews, due diligence meetings, documents thick enough to stop a door. Every morning seemed to begin with another question. Every evening ended with another spreadsheet. The process was exhausting and oddly emotional, because every conversation forced me to revisit the same realization. The thing being valued wasn't an invention, it wasn't luck. It wasn't timing alone, it was experience. Years of solving problems, years of learning, years of carrying responsibility without recognition. The very skills that had been repeatedly underestimated inside my company were now attracting extraordinary attention outside it. There was irony in that, a quiet, almost poetic irony. One afternoon, Elena and I sat beside the harbor, where we'd shared so many conversations. The water shimmered beneath the sunlight. Seagulls drifted overhead. The breeze carried the scent of salt and summer. I told her the latest numbers. She listened carefully, then smiled. Not because of the money, because she understood what the numbers represented. You know, she said, this stopped being about business a long time ago. I looked at her. What do you mean? She pointed toward the water. When we met, you were still trying to prove something. The words landed gently, but they landed. Because she was right. For years, I'd been chasing validation disguised as ambition, trying to earn recognition, trying to convince people, trying to pass evaluations that seemed to move every time I approached them. Somewhere along the way, the goal had changed, without me noticing. The business wasn't proof anymore. It was freedom. Freedom to choose. Freedom to build. Freedom to walk away. And freedom, I discovered, changes how you see everything, including yourself. A month later, the negotiations concluded. The final agreement arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. No dramatic soundtrack, no fireworks, no cinematic celebration, just a document, several signatures, and a number. $52 million. I stared at it for a long time. Not because of the amount, because of the journey attached to it. 12 years earlier, a man had sat across from me and explained why I wasn't leadership material. Now strangers were paying a fortune for a company built from the very capabilities he couldn't or wouldn't recognize. Life has a peculiar sense of humor. I retired shortly afterward. Not because I never wanted to work again, because I wanted the freedom to decide what work meant. For the first few months, I traveled, read books I'd postponed for years, spent long mornings drinking coffee without checking email, watched sunsets without thinking about quarterly objectives. Simple things. Luxuries disguised as ordinary moments. And eventually, almost by accident, an invitation arrived. The company holiday party. My former company. At first, I nearly declined. Then, curiosity won. Curiosity had gotten me into this entire adventure. It seemed fitting to let it finish the story. The ballroom looked exactly as I remembered. Warm lighting, holiday decorations, music floating through the air, the scent of pine, perfume, and catered food. Former colleagues greeted me with surprise. Then excitement. Then questions. Lots of questions. People wanted updates, stories, news. Most of them knew I had left. Few knew why. Fewer knew what happened afterward. As the evening unfolded, I found myself enjoying it more than expected. Not because of nostalgia, because distance had removed the bitterness. Time had transformed old frustrations into perspective. Then HR approached, a friendly woman named Karen, whom I'd known for years. She smiled. "Can I ask something?" "Of course," she laughed. "We've all been wondering." I already knew what was coming. "Why did you retire so early?" The conversation around us continued. Glasses clinked. Music played softly. Several nearby employees turned toward us, waiting, curious. I smiled, then laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that comes when life feels too improbable to explain. After a $52 million exit, I said, I figured I could take a break. Silence. Not complete silence, but the kind that spreads through a small area before anyone realizes it's happening. Karen blinked. Someone nearly dropped a drink. A few people laughed because they assumed I was joking. Then, they realized I wasn't. And at that exact moment, I happened to glance across the room. Richard was standing near the bar. Frozen. Completely frozen. The color drained from his face so quickly, it was almost startling. For a second, neither of us moved. 12 years of conversations seemed to compress into that single moment. All the evaluations, all the meetings, all the explanations, all the certainty. Gone. Not because I had won, not because he had lost, because reality had delivered its own verdict. And reality doesn't attend performance reviews. I lifted my glass slightly, a small gesture. Nothing more. Richard stared back, then slowly looked away. The music continued. The party carried on. People resumed talking, laughing, celebrating. But I stood there for a moment longer, watching the lights shimmer against the ballroom windows, thinking about how strange life can be. The people who define your limits often understand the least about your potential. And the moment you stop asking them to decide your future finally becomes your own.